Hello again and welcome back to our course on PSC 15. In this section we're going to take a look at importing images from a scanner. And if you won't be using a scanner or you've used a scanner already, you know how to get images from a scanner into PSC, you can skip this section. One of the problems with explaining how to use a scanner with PSC is that there are so many different types of scanner, and how to use them very often depends to some extent on the operating system, that it's impossible to give an absolutely generic set of instructions on how to do this. So what I'm going to do is to take you through a pretty typical example using a multifunction printer. That's one with a scan capability, which is the sort of printer that many people have at home nowadays, and using Windows 10 as usual, just show you how to get a straightforward scan from the printer into PSC. I appreciate that you may have a scanner other than the type that I've just described. You could, for example, have a dedicated flatbed scanner. You may have a film scanner, 35mm scanner. Maybe your intention is to scan in many old images into PSC. But really, as far as getting this working with PSC, think of it as a two-stage process. And the first of these two stages is to make sure that your computer is aware of your scanner, and that as far as you can tell, the scanner should work with your computer. Now, you might be able to use one of the default apps, such as the Windows Scan app, in order to test this out. But from my experience, and I think this is generally accepted, if your operating system cannot see the scanner, then PSC will not see it either. So keep PSC out of the equation to begin with. Just make sure that you can see your scanner in your operating system. In Windows 10 you have sort of two ways of doing this. You probably have more than two ways, but the two ways of doing this I would recommend. One of them is to go into Device Manager, and this is pretty much the same for Windows 7 and Windows 8 or 8.1 as well. Go into Device Manager, and probably under Imaging Devices you will see the device, in my case HP PSC 2500 series, and that device is the scanning device. Now, the same device name will appear under printers because it is a printer and scanner, and if you're using that sort of multifunction device, you may see that device in a number of places. But if I right click on that and look on Properties, then what I should discover is this device is working properly. If you've used Windows for a while, you'll know that that doesn't necessarily mean very much. But if it says anything other than this device is working properly, then you probably have a problem. However, if it says this device is working properly, that's a good sign. It doesn't guarantee success, but it's better than if it doesn't say that. So that's using Device Manager. In Windows 10, if you go to Settings and go into Printers and Scanners, you should see the same device under Printers and Scanners. And if I go to this one, I've actually got a network version of this printer as well as one actually plugged into the device. So it's this one. If I click on Manage, you will see that with that particular device, it works as a printer or a scanner. And again, if it should have a scanner function, you should be able to select that as one of its functions. So you'll see something like scanner properties, hardware properties, etc. And if I click on Open Scanner, then it should open the scanner successfully in the Windows Scan function. And if I click on Preview, I should see a preview of the image that I've loaded into the scanner. And as you can see, I'm now successfully previewing the image that's in the scanner. If all of that works pretty much in the way that it's worked for me there, and as it appears that I can scan from Windows, I can be pretty confident that scanning from PSC has as good a chance as any of working. And I'm going to move on to PSC in just a moment. However, if you've connected your scanning device and there is no sign of it in your operating system, or perhaps you start up a scan program, a scan app like the Windows Scan app, and it can't detect any scanner, then you've really got a problem in getting the scanner working with the operating system. There are various ways to go about solving that problem. One of them obviously is to contact the makers of the scanner. You can check online, perhaps Google, to see if somebody else has had the same problem. Look for updated drivers from the manufacturer of the scanner. Check that Windows or whichever operating system you're using supports that scanner, etc. But really, until you've got your scanner working with the operating system, your chances of it working with PSE are pretty slim. So make sure you've got the scanner working first, and then once it's working, your chances of it working with PSE then become pretty good. I've established here that my scanner is known to Windows 10 on this device, so what I'm going to do now is to go into the organizer and just show you how to make sure that it's set up okay in the organizer. I've started up the organizer. I'm going to go into preferences, and one of the pages is scanner. Now, as you can see, in this case, it has automatically detected my scanner. If it doesn't detect it and comes up with no scanner found, or maybe you may have a couple of scanners attached, you may need to select the one that you want. But basically, make sure that the scanner you intend to use is selected. And once it is selected, again, you've got a pretty good chance of scanning working. On this preferences page now, I'm going to set my preferences for scanning, and it's very important to get these settings right. You have an option in terms of the file formats. It defaults here to JPEG. You have alternatively TIFF and PNG format. I'm going to talk about these formats later on in the course, so I'm not going to go into them now. I've already talked about JPEG and the compression that it does, so I'm going to stick with that as the default. Quality is a much trickier question to answer, really, because generally speaking, when I'm using scanned images, I set the quality as high as I can. But there are a couple of downsides to that. One of them is that the higher you set the quality, the bigger the files are that are generated, and these can be very big files. And secondly, the higher you set the quality, the longer it generally takes to scan. If you have a lot of material to scan, I suggest that you do a couple of test runs. You take a couple of your source images, go right through the process that you intend to follow, not only the scanning process, but perhaps any cropping you're going to do, and any of the other effects or improvements that you're going to apply, many of which we haven't covered on the course yet. But make sure that you go through the whole process and see, first of all, just how big the files are at the end of it, and secondly, see how long it takes. Because if you've got thousands of images to scan and each one of them is going to take an hour to process by the time you've done all the other things to it, you've got a pretty big job ahead of you. So if you have got a lot to scan, go through the whole process and consider carefully the consequences of your settings here. The other option here is the folder that these scanned photos are going to be saved to. Bear in mind, you can move them to more appropriate places later if you want to. So I'm going to go with these defaults for now, and I'm just going to click on OK. So as far as I can tell, my scanner should work, and I've set my preferences accordingly. I go up to the Import button, and one of the options there is From Scanner. Exactly what you see here will depend on your device, because at this point, to a large extent, your device takes over in terms of what its capabilities are. As you can see with the device that I'm using, I've got this little dialog here where I can select what sort of image I'm scanning, but it is a color picture that I've got loaded, so I'm going to stick with the option there of color picture. Note the option here of adjusting the quality of the scanned picture. And note also, as I say, that you may or may not see similar controls depending on the scanner that you're using. If you haven't done scanning from that device before, and particularly via PSE, be prepared to experiment with these different settings to get the best results. I have an option here of doing a preview. One of the big advantages of doing a preview, of course, is that not only can I make sure that everything seems to be aligned okay, I can make sure I've got the image the right way up. Well, of course, you know you can rotate images in PSE, but you may not want the job of rotating loads and loads of images. It'd be better if they were loaded in the scanner correctly first of all anyway. So let me click on Scan. And there is my scanned image. So that's pretty straightforward, but let me just point out one or two important things about this scanned image. The first thing to point out is that you will not get the same sort of metadata that you have if you've got an image from a camera. So the metadata associated with this image is actually pretty limited. I've got pixel dimensions, but obviously nothing about a camera. The second thing is that when I come to look at this image, the quality will depend not only on the settings I've used to scan the image, but also on the quality of the original image. And if the original image is poor, I need realistic expectations for the scanned image. Having said that, and as many people will say, if you've got a poor original and you want to get as good a quality as possible, you probably need to have the settings for scanning set at high quality so that you don't lose any of the little quality you're beginning with. And finally, a point that I made earlier on, and that is that if you have got a lot of images to scan, go through the whole process, get right through to the end result with a couple of sample images before you make final decisions about settings to use when scanning. And if you scan an image and it's a little bit crooked, don't worry too much about that, because we'll be looking at straightening images later on. That's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one.